1, 2, 3, 4. Kumah, 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 Elohim. 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 שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. מקום, 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 מקום האלוהים. מקום, 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 מקום האלוהים. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ.
Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see so many of you. Welcome to our second event of the Kumah Festival. We're excited to be here today, and we're also in a mode of readiness and contemplation as we commemorate this important day in the Jewish calendar called Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. We have guests that I would like to welcome from Poland. There's a few people from Poland. There's a few people, there's some people from New Haven. There's Konstantin and Wojciech and Rabbi Jim and Susan Berger and Ellen Gould and Judi Williams. Those are that, and of course Judy Miner, who kind of is has conducted this event. So thank you all for being with us. A couple words about this day before we begin and what our intention is for today. Yom Hashoah it's one of the most important days of the Jewish calendar, I would say. It's a tremendous opportunity, actually. A tremendous opportunity. there's a lot of possibility of what we can do with this day. And it's, I think, one of the most important things we have to work on as Jewish people. We're dealing here with something that's at the heart of our trauma, that is at the heart of our politics, and that is deeply related to our faith world as people who live in the world. The Holocaust is deeply related to how we are in relation to the world, I think. And so it's a huge opportunity if we can get it right. And every Holocaust Remembrance Day, every Yom Hashoah, we try and figure out what to do with this day. At least I do, especially as an educator. I try and think about how does one educate, especially kids, but how do we educate about this? What is our message? What are we doing here with our memory? What are we doing with our pain? And as I see it, we have kind of three options that we could follow. The first one is we could ignore it. And I think a lot of us do that. Many years, we kind of pass over it because either it's too hard or it's not quite relevant, or the way we've been taught to commemorate it is not necessarily in line with how we experience the world today. We're in conversation with it. And so sometimes the choice is we're gonna skip it. Another thing we could do is we could commemorate it in the way that we've been taught and in the way that we commemorated it when we were younger, in the way that our parents, our teachers, our families, our societies have taught us to commemorate this day, to remember. How do we remember? We remember like we were taught to remember, which is, if I were to summarize it, I would say it's to mourn. That's, I think, the main thing that we were taught is to mourn. We must mourn this very sad historical event. And that's, I think, very important. But there's also problems that arise within that type of remembering. And it can, there's a tremendous sad beauty and beautiful sadness that I remember arising from my earliest Holocaust remembrance days in me. But there are also political implications of things we're kind of being sort of guided to think and to support. And those can sometimes be problematic. And so it leads us to a third possibility, and that's, I think, what we're working on here today. And that's, we want to remember. We want to go into it. We want to dive into this, hard nut in our selfhood, in our history, but we want to find some new ways to remember. That's what we're looking for today. We're looking for new ways to remember, new ways to commemorate. We're looking for the light in the darkness, as Rabbi Jim has defined our event for us today. In our Torah portion this week, we find Aaron, the high priest, dealing with trauma. What happens is the temple is completed, the tabernacle is complete, we're ready to begin for the first time, Jewish practice, Jewish sacrificial practice. There's only one problem. The high priest who's supposed to lead it, every time he looks at the altar, all he can see is the golden calf. That's what the commentators tell us. He looks at it and he's frozen. He can't do it. All he can see is his past, his guilt, his mistake. Did I not do enough? Did I mess this up? The horror that happened. That's all he can see, and so he can't do anything. And so Moses has to come to him and say these words, Krav el hamizbeach. Krav el hamizbeach, come close to the altar. And once he's told that, we have this incredible description of Aaron, the high priest, diving in like a painter about to paint a masterpiece, like a conductor about to start some incredible piece of music. And he dives into that ritual. He starts bringing in the animal and the pieces of the animal and the fire, and he starts sprinkling blood in 7 places. And it's like a symphony of a new type of piece of art, a new type of public performance art for the people that we are starting, and that is involved deeply in that hard, difficult experience that preceded all of this. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for today. We're looking for the artists, and we have some with us today. And we're looking for the people who deal with trauma. We're looking to enter this space in a new way that will be positive thinking, and that will help us, and that will open us. Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet, he wrote, "Gam ha'egrof haya pa'am kaf yad ptucha ve'etzbaot." Even the fist was once an open palm and fingers. So with that, I'm going to invite those of you who have a ner neshama, a memorial candle, to light the candle. I have mine right here. And we're going to light. To the memory of the 6 million. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare ourselves in this way that we did last week, and we'll do every week of the festival, which is by saying the blessing for preparing to receive the Torah in Mount Sinai, the counting of the Omer. We are counting up to find readiness, and that's another thing that we are working on today. I'd like to invite Alison Schlanger to lead us in the blessing of the counting of the Omer.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sefirat haomer.
Amen. Shar koach. Thank you, Alison. Hayom 15 yamim, shehem 2 shavuot, v'yom echad la'omer. Today are 15 days, which are 2 weeks and 1 day to the Omer. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to, or actually most of you probably know her, New Shul founder, Ellen Gould, who's going to sing something for us from the Yiddish, which was translated by her co-founder, Holly Gawanter. Hi, Ellen. We can hear you.
Okay, did I remute myself?
No, you're great.
Oh, good, okay. The hard and the sweet, the nut, that's what you were talking about, Misha, right? Well, Russian Kesmet mandlin, raisins and almonds, the hard and the sweet, is perhaps one of the most beloved of all Yiddish lullabies. And as they say in Yiddish, it is a vergnügen, my great pleasure to be able to sing it for you now, with a loose translation by me and an achingly beautiful last English verse by New Shul co-founder and my dear, dear friend, Holly Gawanter. Russian Kismet Mandlin is the story of a young widow whose greatest dream for her baby son Yidele is that he should grow up to be the most prosperous of merchants, a peddler of raisins and almonds. One more time. in dem Beit HaMikdash, in a little study house, in a winkele cheder, where there is always heat for the poor, sitz Yamone Bastion allein, sits the young widow, daughter of Zion, alone. Ir ben Yochid Yideles Bikzi Keseder, and rocks her son Yidele in a hard wooden cradle, und singt him zum Schlafen a Liederle schön, and sings him to sleep with this gentle refrain. Lu, 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 lu. Unter Niedeles Biegele, under your wooden cradle, Idele, steht a Chlor weiß Ziegele, sits a little white goat. Dos Ziegeles gefahren handeln. One day he will pull your wood cart to market. Das wird sein dein Beruf, for this will be your profession. Rajin Kes mit Mandeln, a peddler of raisins and almonds, the hard and the sweet. Schlaf, schlaf, my idle sleep. There will come a time when trains made of iron will cover the whole world and take you away. The road you must travel will cross the horizon and lead to the riches I sing of today. But when you become a wealthy man, you must remember where we all began. Lu, 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 lu. Rajin Kes mit Mandeln, Schlaf, schlaf, mein Idel,
Thank you very much, Ellen. It's beautiful. Now I would like to introduce new Shul member Susan Berger, whose family story was the genesis of this event today.
Until 2014, Zbaszyn was a name that I recognized as a place in my mother's history, but with no knowledge of most of the details other than it was where, at age 9, she went with her mother Sabina and 13-year-old brother Fedor after fleeing Berlin in the early spring of 1939. At the end of October 1938, on the eve of World War II, in an event called the Poland Auction, 17,000 German Jews, mostly men of all ages who had Polish origins, were suddenly rounded up, arrested, stripped of their property and money, and put on trains by the SS to the Polish border. This is considered the first official act of the final solution. An estimated 8,000 arrived without warning in Zbaszyn, a border town of a bit more than 5,000 people. Some arrived at the train station. However, thousands of others were chased for many kilometers in their everyday city clothes through a forest during a cold, rainy night, with Nazi soldiers firing rifles into the air, striking the deportees with rifle butts, and setting large dogs upon them. Many died or were injured. My grandfather, Leo Adler, a devoted family man of deep faith who loved to sing in synagogue, and his oldest son, Norbert, 16, were among those who were deported. It was in Zbaszyn that my mother, grandmother, and uncle were reunited with her father and brother, an older brother. The photo of the whole family, unknowingly together for the last time, has been etched in my mind. Zbaszyn lived in the shadow of the other, more traumatic experiences of the war for my mother. That's why it came as much as such a surprise in 2014 when a young German graduate student, Veronique Mikisch, taking a course at the Free University in Berlin, contacted my parents' synagogue, Temple Israel of Long Beach, New York, having found an obituary from my dear Uncle Fedor, which mentioned that he was an active member there. Her assignment was to research what happened to my grandfather following his deportation. She had already seen my mother and her brother's video testimonies online and came to interview my mother in person several months later. I'm very pleased to say Veronique is with us here today. Hi, Veronique. Hopefully, along with Olina Bote, who was hoping to be able to make it, but it seems like she has not been able to, who was an instructor of that course. It is because of Veronique and her teachers that we have a stumbling stone, Stolperstein in German, for my grandfather in the sidewalk in front of what had been the family's Berlin address. It is one of many thousands that have been installed by the German performance artist Gunter Demnig in honor of the Jews who were murdered by the Nazis. In Zbaszyn, when the German Jews arrived, local inhabitants provided warm water and some food for the traumatized, disoriented refugees. Shelter was offered in a variety of ways and places, including a flour mill and in stables with the horses. The refugees who landed in neighboring towns fared significantly less well than those who were fortunate to be in Zbaszyn at that time. Within days, a refugee camp was set up by the Joint Distribution Committee, headquartered in Warsaw, headed by Emanuel Ringelblum and Yitzhak Gitterman. Within 5 weeks, there was a 50-bed hospital, a dental clinic, a first aid station, classes in Polish and Yiddish, classes for children, a sports club, and many other services. 500 of the refugees were hired to administer all this, and 10 to 15 Jews came from other parts of Poland to assist. During the 10 months refugees stayed in Zbaszyn, 1,500 were housed in homes of local residents with expenses met by the aid committee. My mother's family was fortunate to be one of them. A few were able to leave Poland and even Europe from Zbaszyn. Most could not and went where they had relatives or were able to find living quarters in Jewish communities. Most spoke only German. My mother's family went to stay with relatives in Eastern Poland. Ultimately and tragically, most of the refugees, including my grandfather, were later murdered by the Nazis. For my grandfather, along with approximately 200 men, it was on Rosh Hashanah, September 1939, the first month of the war, outside of a small town where the family went after Zbaszyn in what was the first massacre of Jews in the war. In 2018, there was an exhibition on the Poland auction in Berlin, to which descendants of those who were in Zbaszyn in 1938 were invited as part of the 80th anniversary commemoration. The exhibition organizers took us to Zbaszyn, and I'm happy to say that many members of my extended family were with us in 2018 and are with us now on Zoom. My parents, Simon and Rita Berger, are also with us today. Hi, Mom and Dad. Can you see me? Okay. Thank you for coming. Approximately 80 of us from the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and Israel arrived in Zbaszyn following a 2.5-hour bus ride from Berlin and were greeted by Wojciech Olejniczak, the photographer and artist who in 2007 began delving into his town's history during the Poland auction and is most responsible for making what he valued in that history come alive for its current residents and now for us. I am pleased to say Wojciech is with us here today as well. Hi, Wojciech. With a kind, I have to find my place. With a kind, humble, and purposeful demeanor, he took us on a walking tour of Zbaszyn, pointing out the most important sites of 1938. The town's buildings and population size are pretty much the same today. To warm up from the cold and rain during our tour, we were given hot tea in mugs imprinted with a photo of a Jewish family that had been there. That mug has become a prized possession for me. We stopped outside a house in which a man from Israel who knew his grandfather had been sheltered there asked for a minyan so that he could pray in gratitude. Later, they took us to an auditorium with the back half filled with townspeople dressed in their Sunday best, who had been waiting patiently for over an hour for us to fill the empty seats up front. As dramatic as the day was up until that point, nothing prepared us for what followed, which was for me one of the most moving commemorative events related to the Holocaust. A theatrical performance done annually by high school students since 2008 that enacts the Jewish refugees' experience. This theatrical performance is Zbaszyn's memorial to the Holocaust. As my cousin Leo, one of the family members who is with us now on Zoom from Toronto, Canada, other family members are on from Israel actually too, and all over the States, said at the time, it is more powerful than any plaque or statue. Here is a video of one song from that incredible performance that conveys something of the wholeheartedness of the town's youth as they portrayed refugees, and I must say, pride in their family's history, their town's history of having done the right thing. Not all, but many. Telling the story in that performance based on actual letters, a living memorial, and an intergenerational transmission of decency and empathy during a time of political evil.
Okronie pamięci kurz, te uliczki i się czapy kupców rój. Płotek z kozą, żywicielką, krawca szmula z brodą wielką, co jak nic umiał szyć ślubny strój. A zakochane oczy śnią, otula się jej obuwą. Zapomniany świat i płynie, płynie w dal, z kogucimi barani łbem, na białej si płynie sen, tak jak malował pan Chagall. Już zmierzony ślubny strój, rudy krawczy atłas swój i odmierzał łokciem śnieżno-biały tniu. Nim wypieści ślubną suknię, migo srebro, srebro stuknie, a ty żyć będziesz jak ten król. A zapomniany pociąg dni uderzał. Zapomniany świat i płynie, płynie w dal, pobiegł niczym zapał brak, uderza się zmęczony świat, tak jak malował pan Chagall. Zmienił się świat piękny na
Wish it was
Chagalla,
loud.
płótna twarz, miał ten chłopak, gdy w pociągu zabrzmiał gwizd. Pozostały na peronie nasze uniesione góry dłonie i ten krzyk, bywaj zdrów, napisz list. A zapłakane oczy śnią, otula się jej obłą. Smutny pociąg i odpływa w dal, he, w dal, o ciepłym, dobrym domu sen, w tunelu ciemnym ginie hen. Nie tak malował pan Chagall. Łzy obeschły dawno już, lecz strumień nie mógł umyć. Biały tniu, bywaj zdrów, napisz list. A zapłakane oczy śnią, otula się jej obłą. Zapomniany świat i płynie, płynie w dal, strumień oczu zapał brak, odejdzie cały świat, tak jak malował pan Chagall.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Rabbi Jim Ponet. Good, thank you. Rabbi Jim Ponet here. I'm deeply moved to be sharing the celebration, commemoration of Yom Hashoah with the new Shul. When I first heard this story from Susan, it struck me that it rhymed with an experience I had taking students through Auschwitz-Birkenau, actually, the end of a tour of Birkenau that was led by a press officer named Pavel Savitsky at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He sat us down in a grove of trees very close to the ruins of a crematorium that we had visited. And he said, I want you to know that Birkenau was surrounded by villages, Polish villages. I don't remember whether he said he actually lived in one of those. And the villagers were aware of what was happening. Now, in order to be recognized as a heroic saver at Yad Vashem, the memorial in Jerusalem, a bar has been set. You have to have risked your life in a credible manner, and you have to have saved at least one person. The villagers didn't meet that standard, but I found over 1,000, and I'm doing further research, of people who exhibited what I call goodwill. They did not risk their lives. They did not save a single soul, but their gestures were there. They brought food to the edge and smuggled medical supplies to the edge of the camp where those inmates who came out to work the fields could bring the food or the medicine in. Gestures of that ilk. I think it's terribly important, he said, to call these to mind. As you can imagine, among the students were all seminary students. Two or three that year were rabbinical students. And one of the rabbinical students in particular could not allow that story to be told. It was a source of great pain and anguish for her at that time. We've been through the horror of what we've seen here, and you bring us your guilty conscience. She didn't say that to him, but as she allowed herself to weep with rage thereafter, one couldn't help but understand. And so that brings us to the core of what we're looking at here today that Misha opened us with, how to deal with the horror that occurred without lying about it. Through our good fortune, I got in touch with Kostek, with Konstanty Gebert, who was born in Warsaw, born, I believe, in Warsaw, grew up in Warsaw, lives in Warsaw, a journalist, an author, a writer, an activist, involved in the liberation of Poland from the Soviet hold through Solidarity and others. He went underground. Journalist, one of the founders of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews, founder and first editor of Midrash, a Polish Jewish intellectual journal, and the author of an amazing book, which I call to your attention, Living in the Ashes, 2008. It begins by describing the experience of being visited when shortly after the liberation in 1989, I guess, a group of Jews, kibbutznikim from Israel, came to visit. There was a public reading. Kostek is his personal nickname, was there, and they treated him well. But when they finally were alone with him in the living room of his house, these Israelis, in characteristic Israeli fashion, one might suggest, said to him, "How can you live here? It's a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery. How can you live here?" His book is response to that. It's called Living in the Ashes. And he explains why he does live there. And when we said to him, we have a story about Zbaszyn. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. We're going to trust Kostek to get it right for us. And that Susan Berger had given over. And would he be interested and willing to speak with us about it? He said, I'm all for propaganda of goodness as long as there's some truth to it. What a beautiful way of putting it. His book captures that sense that as horrible as the war for memory is right now in Poland, and Kostek's in it, he sees possibilities beyond the extremes that dominate the discourse. He recognizes the politics of memory. He sees what's going on. He knows it intimately in his flesh, and he is there. It is therefore terribly important to us on this day, as Misha laid it out for us, that we begin thinking about the meaning of goodness in a world of evil, the significance of light in a world of darkness. This is more important to us today than ever, particularly for us American Jews who've seen many lights go out in our country over the last couple of years, and who need to be able to live here with as much integrity as you do there. And so I'm about to offer the stage to Kostek, and with the great hope that we'll be able to hear you coming all the way to us from Warsaw. You should know, ladies and gentlemen, that there will be a Q&A after Kostek talks a bit. Maybe I'll ask a question or two, and then it'll open to you. So start sending your questions on chat. Judi will gather them, and we'll have some time to do that thereafter. So Kostek, thank you ever so much for being with us. Let me invite you to kind of share your thoughts in the face of what you've heard and what you know and who you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for inviting me and having me. Zbaszyn, you got it almost right. Benson in German. Zbaszyn is part of my family history. My mother, Zichrona Lebracha, was one of the Jewish volunteers who collected clothing and food in Warsaw in the fall of 1938 to send to Zbaszyn to the Jewish refugees there. And the Zbaszyn story and its contemporary repercussions is a fascinating test case of what people do when they're faced with evil. Most of the information we have on Zbaszyn confirm what Susan Berger has just told us from her research, that people behaved decently. And that's surprising because Zbaszyn, like much of Western Poland, was very viciously anti-Semitic. It's an interesting sociological fact of pre-war Poland that anti-Semitism increased with the decrease of the ratio of the Jewish population. Western Poland, where very few Jews lived, in the town of Zbaszyn, which had almost 5,000 inhabitants, there were a dozen Jewish families. Anti-Semitism was much more acute than in the eastern borderlands of the country, where the Jewish ratio could climb in places to 30%, at times even in Stedtlach, to a majority. So most of Zbaszyn never saw a living Jew, but they knew the Jews are the enemy, right? They're the source of Poland's misfortune, and they should be hated and fought. And suddenly the Jews arrive, a literal invasion. Within 2 days, the population of Zbaszyn more than doubled. And they're not what people thought they are. They're old ladies, they're kids, they're people. And it's simply, regardless of what you think, it's impossible to refuse an old lady a mug of tea, right? And you're not going to charge her either, even if she's the 20th old lady on the line. There was nothing extraordinary in the behavior of the inhabitants of Zbaszyn. This is the way that people are supposed to act, right? We're supposed to help each other, unless we put it against the backdrop of what happened immediately after. If you remember, Zbaszyn was the triggering factor of Kristallnacht, the huge German pogrom. What happened was that amongst the Polish Jews who were summarily expelled from Germany by the German Nazi authorities, there were the parents of a young Jew, Herr Grinspan, who was in Paris at that time. They sent him a letter telling them how horribly they had been treated by the Germans. And Grinspan went to the German embassy in Paris and shot a German diplomat, which gave Himmler the pretext he was long waiting for to launch a pogrom of the Jews in Germany. This was, as Polish Jewish historian Jerzy Tomaszewski had written, the prelude to the Shoah. But the people in Zbaszyn didn't know that then. All they knew is that suddenly they've got a flood of humanity to try to take care of. It took a few days before anybody got organized, the Polish state included. In the first 2 days, it was possible for the Jews who were exiled from Germany to Poland to travel on if they had the money. Most of them didn't. They had to leave all their belongings behind in Germany, and they were herded across the border with next to nothing or nothing. Then Poland prevented Jews from leaving, much in the same way as Arab states insisted on having Palestinian refugee camps in order to keep the issue alive. However, if you cannot leave, well, you have to find a way of living where you are. The Jewish community stepped in. Funds were collected, food, clothing. The emigre wave, the expellee wave rather, was larger than the 6,000 who found their way to Zbaszyn. It was 17,000 people in all. In Poznań, which was the regional capital, every Jewish family took in refugees. The Polish state didn't help much, but didn't hinder either. And Polish authorities in Germany, consular and diplomatic, actually went out of their way to try to help Jews, especially the consulate in Leipzig, where 1,300 Jews were hosted on the grounds of the consulate and thus prevented from being expelled. However, nobody is blameless in the story of Zbaszyn. The Polenaxion, the expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany, was a result of a law that had been passed in the Polish parliament earlier that year, which canceled the Polish citizenship of anybody who had lived abroad for 5 years or more without returning to Poland to have his passport extended. Now, the Polish Jews who were living in Germany, about 100,000 of the 500,000 German Jewish population had Polish citizenship because they were born, or they were descendants of people who were born on German territories that became Polish after Poland was rebuilt after World War I. They had the German option, they availed themselves of it. And then they moved westwards. They had no connections with Poland in most cases, no family that could help them. Most of them didn't speak a word of Polish. Although when Ellen sang us Rodzinkę mit Mandeln, some of them might recognize the Lulilu, which is a Polish lullaby. Lulaj means sleep gently. It's one of many Polish words that found their way into Yiddish and have bound us. So Germans, afraid that they will end up with a huge stateless population they'll have to take care of, expelled the Polish Jews just before their passports would have expired. The Polish parliament passed that law after the Anschluss of Austria, fearing that Greater Germany will expel Jews and Poland will have to take care of them, the Jews that nobody wanted. In the meantime, in Evian in France, in the summer of '38, you have a conference on Jewish refugees from Germany that ends with, well, nothing. Everybody agrees it's a problem and somebody should take care of it. Nobody wanted us. The Poles could argue quite reasonably that the Polish Jews' connection to Poland is tenuous at best. They've never been to Poland. I mean, the Polish Jews in Germany, never been to Poland, don't speak the language. In any case, the German action was completely illegal and criminal. Germany can't just expel people. So Germany should take care of them. And to ram the point home, Poland rounded up about 1,000 Germans that they threatened to expel to Germany if Germany doesn't do something about the Polish Jews they had expelled to Poland. Among those Germans rounded up in Poland, there were 27 German Jews living in Poland. And interestingly enough, negotiations between the two governments soon moved in the direction of how are we going to carve up the Jews' property. The Germans were willing to strike a deal if they're allowed to keep 80% of the Jews' property, and they were perfectly happy for Poland to get the remaining 20%, and Germany would not challenge that in court. The fact that this property belonged to real and living people was irrelevant and immaterial. And yet, Poland is not necessarily uncaring in this story. At the same time as Zbaszyn happens, Poland is engaged in deep negotiations with the Zionist movement, especially Beitar, on Polish clandestine support for Zionist activities in Palestine. Poland actually exported illegally weapons for the Haganah, fully knowing that they are supposed to be used against the British, who were Poland's major ally against Germany. So why on earth is Warsaw risking its relationship with its major ally for some exotic cause in Palestinian sands? Well, because Jabotinsky had promised Poland that if he gets the weapons, he will evacuate 100,000 Jews a year. Now, Jabotinsky was, of course, fooling the Poles, but the Poles desperately wanted to believe that somebody will come and solve the Jewish problem for Poland. So Poland sends in weapons. Thank God London didn't find out about it till after the war. They were not desperate to stand up in defense of Poland's independence. That would have given the Brits a great reason not to. On the other hand, had the Germans not attacked, who knows if Poland would not have found itself with a right-wing regime of its own, expelling Jews, possibly at the same time supporting a Jewish struggle against the Brits in Palestine. Why are we discussing those ifs? Because history is obvious after the fact. As long as it hasn't happened, it hasn't. There's nothing obvious. Why did the Germans choose Zbaszyn? Because it had a very impressive railroad station. By the time Susan got there, probably it looked like a slum because railroads aren't a big thing nowadays. But then it was a huge, impressive station. Why? Because it was the first Polish railroad station after the crossing of the German border. And all international delegations coming into Poland would cross at Zbaszyn, where this impressive station would greet them, and the Polish state could show its power and ambition. And therefore, there was a building that housed those Jews. History is never done until it's done, and only after the fact do we discover its meaning. For the people in Zbaszyn today, the Jewish history of their town for a long time was simply non-existent, and frankly, they couldn't be blamed for that, right? There was no major Jewish history in Zbaszyn until 38, nor was there any after 39. Incidentally, the last train to leave Zbaszyn with the last Jewish refugees on it left on September 1st, 39, the Germans bombed it, of course. So the Jewish episode in the history of Zbaszyn is minor. Its moral relevance is huge. Zbaszyn unexpectedly behaved decently, not heroically. People didn't go way out of their way to help. But in anti-Semitic Zbaszyn, didn't have riots just because of the small occurrence that the city got invaded by more Jews than it had a population. So unexpectedly, people behaved decently, which, if I remember my Judaism correctly, is what will rebuild the temple, right? Unreasonable goodness. A goodness against sensible expectations. And yes, there was also unreasonable evil when a group of Polish poets and writers pooled their resources and gave a substantial contribution to help the exiles in Zbaszyn. In the city of Lublin, which is now Eastern Poland, then it was Central Poland, before Poland got kicked across the map. One of those who contributed, Józef Czechowicz, was subject to such a hate campaign for helping Jews that he had to publicly apologize and say that he didn't know it was to help Jews. He was told it's only for a humanitarian cause. And this is why he contributed, and he added, and my goodwill was abused. Czechowicz was a decent poet and a decent human being. He simply could not stand the hate. But that hate didn't happen in Zbaszyn, although you would have expected it to happen because of the politics of the town. It happened halfway across the country, where the old ladies and the crying kids were already seen as the Jew, therefore the enemy. In Zbaszyn, for some reason, the enemy became human beings, and turned out it's much more difficult to hate human beings than to hate the enemy. And if Zbaszyn today reconnects with that past, it is not only because it's the only event of European historical importance that ever happened in the town, which is already reason enough, but also because it's an argument and an ongoing debate, not only about the past, but the present and the future. By commemorating and celebrating the help it gave to Jews, Zbaszyn is saying something to the current Polish government, which sadly is nationalistic. It is distorting the history of the Shoah and celebrating an illegitimate good feeling about Poland, which cannot do anything wrong. And the people of Zbaszyn could probably tell the prime minister, oh, we can. And even in this town, we did. But we also did something right. And we don't want this to be forgotten or to be distorted. The song that you heard was written by a very famous Polish songwriter, Wojciech Młynarski, an extremely beloved figure, sadly passed away a few years ago. It was written to commemorate the Jews expelled from Poland in 1968 under the communist government. And this is a motive that anybody in Poland will recognize: the parting at the railroad platform, the call, stay safe, write a letter. It's not the station in Zbaszyn people were thinking about hearing that song. It was Gdańsk station in Warsaw, from which daily in 68, I would see my friends leave. The 5 p.m. express to Vienna, we called it the Treblinka Express. The trains for Treblinka actually left from several hundred meters away from where the station is located. History is not over. And the challenges it puts in front of us are, I think, best understood in the light of how people address those challenges in the past. And I find this Zbaszyn story a very reassuring one, that people can be surprised into acting decently before their ideology kicks in. Now, had the Germans given advance warning, had they told the people of Zbaszyn, we're going to send you all our Jews and you deal with them, maybe then the bad guys in Zbaszyn would have the time to prepare and the welcome would have been different. But surprised people instinctively acted decently, as if this were our default mode. I'm not really sure it is, but Zbaszyn gives us hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was astounding, Kostek. Astounding. I found myself laughing and crying through your presentation. I know others were as well. I want to note here that we do have Wojciech Olejniczak, who is the man in Zbaszyn who took it upon himself. Welcome, Wojciech, with us. And after we, he speaks Polish. He does not have English. Konstanty, your English is exquisite. But he will be able to receive questions as well when we go to a Q&A mode. People who wish to put questions to him, we're going to ask Kostek to translate those questions and then and his answers, so that so if you have questions for Wojciech, please keep sending them in. I think I'll just I'm really speechless after what you delivered, and I know there are some questions that are gathering. The details that you give over, the nuance, the complexity, and your repeated statement, history is not over. It's never over. And it just hasn't happened yet. You're talking, I mean, that's such a wild thing to say. And I can hear how that's part of your optimism, which I know is somehow deeply mingled with your own Yiddishkeit, which is deep. So the way you gave over the Polish word lullaby, and you said, that's like so many other words in Yiddish come from Polish. And I don't know if you said it anchors us here, but it was as if it's part of an implicit answer as to why you live in the country of ashes, the land of ashes, that there's an anchoring, and that the story is not over. The history is not done. We don't know where it goes. That seems to be part of your capacity, part of your understanding, part of your raison d'etre, part of your Yiddishkeit, your Jewish faith. I think it was Hannah Arendt who observed that had there been more tales like that of Anton Schmidt, the Nazi officer who made munitions available to Jewish partisans outside of Vilna, had there been more stories like that and who was executed for what he had done, the world would be a very different place. And what you're saying is not only would it be, it still can be. And that's number one. Number two, that decency, sheer decency. You brought to our mind the importance of menschlichkeit, and you brought that dimension of surprise to it. So beautiful that had they not been surprised, who knows how they would have acted. So you're speaking about a basic goodness in human beings, and you see it, and you're there, not far from the Warsaw Ghetto. You're there, so I thought I was going to ask you a question. I guess I'm I'm astounded by what you've given over, edified and elevated, and so I can't pose a question except to say we need more from you, people. You got to get this book, Living in the Land of Ashes, and Kostek, you've got more to write. And you might have to go on a speaking tour around the world. Misha and the new Shul will be glad to sponsor you. So I think we should probably go to Q&A now. Judi Miner has been collecting questions that you've put. They could be directly to Kostek or to Wojciech, who, again, was the person that Susan told us about, who put together back in 2008. I was going to ask Kostek what he thought was going on in the mind of Wojciech, but I think we can let Wojciech do that for us. And I also feel that Kostek took us deep into it, deeply. Before I start asking my questions, I defer to you, Judi Miner.
Okay. First question is for Kostek. Is the history that you were describing to us, is that included in the book Living in the Ashes? Or is the Living in the Ashes separate or additional or expanded?
Well, Living in the Land of Ashes tries to retrace the history of Polish Jews after the Shoah, from 44 onwards. So obviously, the events of the Shoah and what preceded it are not the main topic, but unavoidably it returns in discussing the debates that took place in Poland after '89 regarding what happened in the Shoah and what was the fate of the Jews. And back, Jim, to your observations, it's immensely important to keep at all times a sense of proportion. Most people never really get the chance of finding out that they can do good things, okay? It's a privilege. And very often, people are scared in doing that. And if you look at wartime Poland, many more people betrayed the Jews or murdered them outright than helped them or saved them. And most people were blessedly indifferent. The Jews were trying to hide, were hoping for indifference. But I had the privilege of working with Polish righteous Gentiles. And the fascinating thing about them is that they had just one thing in common. And no, it was not socioeconomic background. They went the gamut from uneducated peasants to university professors, politically from communists to rabid Polish nationalists, religiously from Catholics to Protestants to militant atheists and whatever. They just had one thing in common, and that was they couldn't convince themselves that it's none of their business. And when they took me into their confidence, some of them would tell me, you know, the people we saved in our basement, I didn't like them, okay? They were not nice people. And had I chosen tenants, I wouldn't choose them. But I didn't do the choosing. I mean, they were there, they needed help, so I helped. I couldn't help myself but help. And I genuinely believe that the existence of the righteous Gentiles is empirical proof of the existence of God, okay? They wouldn't have done it without him, her, whatever, including those who were and remained committed atheists. I don't think that God is very much interested in the party card we carry in our pocket, right? He's not interested in what we think of him. He's interested in what he thinks of us. And that this is the real lesson. And I tried to address this also in the book, but as I said, this is not the main topic. Sorry, a rambling answer to a simple question, but maybe helpful.
I think we enjoy your rambling very much. Not rambling at all. Another follow-up question is, could you talk a little bit more about the project you're involved in terms of Polish commemoration of the Poland action?
I'm not actually involved in it. It's Zbaszyn is involved, but it is a very characteristic example of something that has been happening all over Poland ever since '89, ever since the fall of communism. It's non-Jews taking responsibility for the Jewish history of their towns. It can be people who stop puzzling about those weird tombstones in an unintelligible language out there on the meadow and decide that, well, look, since their people are no longer here, it comes on us to take care of it because it's now our heritage. In a way, they cannot allow themselves to be convinced that it's not their business. It's not their cemetery, it's not their synagogue, it's not their problem. Because since we live here, It is ours. In the sense, it is our responsibility. In Western Poland, this can become extremely complicated because what is today Western Poland, until 45 was Eastern Germany, until that part of Germany was annexed to Poland, the Germans expelled, and Poles fleeing the eastern half of Poland, which was annexed to the Soviet Union, moved in. And amongst other things, they got what was left of the Jewish heritage of those places, with which they had a double disconnect. A, it was Jews, not Poles. B, it was German Jews on top of that. And yet, it comes. People take care of it. People start researching the history. There's a boom industry in the history of Jews of Gliwice, used to be the German Gleiwitz, with local students boning up on the history, recreating the Jewish life of Gliwice. Why? Because it's our responsibility. It's our town. It's our history. Somebody has to do it, period. And Zbaszyn, which was Poland until 39, until the Germans occupied it, is a good example of this. Well, in a place of no lions, you be the lion, right?
I'd like to, with your help, Kostek, in translating, I'd like to direct some questions to Wojciech.
Sure.
First of all, that question, my mistake, was intended for Wojciech if he could speak more about the commemoration of the Poland action that he is involved in. And then there's another question for him as well.
Pytanie do pana, czy może pan coś więcej powiedzieć o upamiętnianiu Poland Action, w które pan jest zaangażowany?
To już jest 12 lat naszej pracy i można powiedzieć, że rozpoczęło się od takich porządków rodzinnych, ponieważ mam w domu książki, które mają stempel Robotniczy Komitet Pomocy Żydom, uchodźcom z Niemiec, i po prostu nie spytałem ojca, skąd mamy te książki. Ojciec zmarł i musiałem tą pracę jakby wykonać sam, żeby... Okay.
It has been going on for 12 years now, and it started with home cleaning. I discovered at home 2 books that had the stamp of the Workers' Committee to help the Jewish refugees in Zbaszyn. And I never asked my father where they came from. And my father passed away, he's no longer with us. But this tickled my imagination. Bardzo proszę.
I gdy pokazała się książka profesora Tomaszewskiego, Preludium Zagłady, no wszystko mi się ułożyło w głowie jako pewna całość i nie mogłem zrozumieć, dlaczego tej dobrej historii o Zbąszyniu się nie pamięta.
But then the book by Professor Jerzy Tomaszewski, Prelude to the Shoah, which is about the Poland Action, was published, and it clicked, and I understood what had happened. What I didn't understand is why nobody remembers the good history of Zbaszyn.
To zajęło mi trochę czasu, żeby to zrozumieć. I można powiedzieć, kolejne projekty, kolejne pomysły jakby miały na celu utwierdzenie tej tezy pod jednym warunkiem, że nie będziemy zapominali o drugiej stronie tego, tak? Że to nie jest tak, że jesteśmy świetni. Ktoś wydał te rozkazy, ktoś to podpisał, ktoś to egzekwował, tak? To nie jest jednostronna gra.
And eventually I understood why this has not been commemorated and decided that something has to be done about it. And I still am on it with one important caveat: we cannot forget the other side. There were evil orders issued, somebody issued them, somebody made sure that they get implemented. we cannot fall into the trap of believing that we were only wonderful.
Udało nam się jeszcze spotkać starszych ludzi, którzy byli naocznymi świadkami. Rozmawialiśmy z nimi. To jest bardzo ważne, że oni też zaczęli się zastanawiać, dlaczego my o tym nie pamiętamy. Tak? To jest na dłuższą rozmowę historia, żeby uchwycić te momenty, kiedy się to zapominało, tak? Jakie mechanizmy w Polakach się włączały, żeby wyrugować to z pamięci. Natomiast powoli w Zbąszyniu już wiedzą o tym. To też nie jest tak, jak jest, tak?
We were still able to speak to some elderly people who remember the events, and they themselves were puzzled. Actually, why is it that this is not remembered? And we started tracking down the mechanism of forgetting, how something is removed from public awareness. And it also doesn't happen overnight like this. It's also a process. And we also needed to face that.
Ludzie mają pamiątki po tych, którzy tam u nich mieszkali. Tak? Jakieś gifty, jakieś drobne przedmioty, listy, pamiętają imiona i nazwiska. Dla mnie to było odkrycie, że oni to po raz drugi odkrywają.
People have mementos of the refugees who had stayed under their roofs. They have gifts, they have letters. And for me, the discovery was to see them rediscover those things.
Myślę, że Zbąszyn już jest innym miastem, trochę innym niż 10-12 lat temu. I największą dla mnie satysfakcją jest to, że ja już temu nie patronuję. Ja już nie muszę się tym zajmować, że sami młodzi ludzie zaczynają mieć własne pomysły, że powstał zbąszyński bałagan animowany przez licealistów, że pomysł na Stolpensteiny w Zbąszyniu nie jest mój. Mimo że myśmy to przeprowadzili, ale to przyszło do mnie, tak? Bo ktoś kolejny i tak dalej, i tak dalej.
And the greatest satisfaction is that I'm no longer in charge of it. Zbąszyn today is a different town, at least somewhat different than it was 12 years ago. The people have started taking up initiatives. There is the Zbąszyn Balagan run by high school kids. There are initiatives that I didn't even know of. The Stolpensteine in Zbąszyn were not my idea. Somebody else came up with that.
To jeżeli się sumuje te wszystkie działania, poczynając od wystawy, książki, filmu, strony internetowej, potem wystawa w Berlinie, to wszystko jest jakąś taką kulą śnieżną, która, jak powiedziałem na tym spotkaniu, nie ma pomnika w Zbąszyniu, ale jakby ta pamięć młodzieży jest lepszym pomnikiem.
And if you add it all up, the exhibition, the book, the exhibition in Berlin, it's a snowball. It just keeps on growing and growing. And I once remarked that there is no monument in Zbąszyn to the Polish Nation, but the memory of the high school kids is a better monument than anything that could have been set up.
I can jump in with a question there. Thank you so much, Wojciech. The question is, so how did this performance come to be? Whose idea was it to have the high school students perform this living memorial and to do it every year?
pytanie do pana, jak doszło do tych występów młodzieżowych, czyj to był pomysł i jak to się dzieje, że to się powtarza z roku na rok?
No, początek był mój. Poprzez profesora Tomaszewskiego poznałem panią Gertrudę Pickham w Berlinie, która opracowywała listy młodej dziewczynki do brata wysyłane ze Zbąszynia. To była Greta Schiffman, która kilkanaście listów się zachowała z nich. I po przeczytaniu książki Tomaszewskiego miałem taki drugi, zupełnie inny obraz. Dziewczynka, która nic nie rozumie, bo nie ma pojęcia o polityce, nie ma pojęcia o czym, co oni tutaj w ogóle robią, tylko opisuje świat, opisuje Zbąszyn. To było fascynujące, tak?
Thanks to Professor Tomaszewski, I touched base with Gerda Pickham in Berlin, who has been researching letters of the deportees in Zbąszyn. And there's a collection of of over a dozen letters written by a young girl, Greta Schiffman, to her brother in Berlin. And she's just like a 12-year-old. She has no idea of politics. She doesn't understand what's happening. She simply describes what she sees. She describes Zbąszyn.
I pomyślałem wtedy, że przetłumaczyliśmy, bo to były teksty po niemiecku, przetłumaczyliśmy to na polski i zaniosłem do szkoły. Zaniosłem do nauczycielki i powiedziałem, że to było te 12 lat temu, gdy przygotowywaliśmy pierwsze wydarzenie, że to jest materiał do pracy, że może coś z tym zrobić. Tak powstała pierwszy spektakl, tak?
We got those letters translated into Polish, and I took them to the local high school, to the teacher, and said, look, this is a great stuff for a performance. And that's how it got started 12 years ago. That was the first event.
I myślę, że atrakcyjne to było dla nich przede wszystkim, bo była to opowieść rówieśnika, tak? Tam nie było polityki, tam nie było, tam było, poszliśmy na dworzec i znów czekaliśmy, aż pociąg odjedzie. Tak, znaczy to jest inny przekaz po prostu.
And I think it was attractive to the kids because these were letters written by a peer, by somebody like them. It wasn't about politics or history. It was about, so we had to go to the station and then we had to wait for the train. Something they could relate to.
I myślę, że w tym tkwi urok, to złe słowo, ale atrakcyjność tego tekstu dla młodego człowieka.
And I think that this is the source of the charm, if you will allow this word, the attractiveness of those letters for young people today.
I ja zająłem się innymi sprawami, zajmowałem się książką, zajmowałem się filmem, a licealiści z tym zostali, tak? I okazało się, że ta pierwsza nauczycielka, która pracowała z uczniami, odeszła już, jakby nie pracowała w liceum, że przejęły to następni nauczyciele. To jest jakby, że również starsi przechwycili tą pałeczkę, tak? I to oni namawiali kolejne roczniki, żeby po prostu poznać tą historię.
And I eventually stopped being involved in that. I had the book to write, I had a film, and the kids continued on their own. And eventually, the teacher to whom I had brought the letters left the school. New teachers came in, and they joined in as well. So it wasn't only the kids, it was also the teachers that simply continued what has now become a tradition.
I w pewnym momencie, gdy doszło do wymiany uczniów z liceum izraelskim i przyjechała młodzież stąd nawzajem i Polacy pojechali do swoich rówieśników w Izraelu, nauczyli się piosenek, nauczyli się nowych tekstów i ci, co byli na występie w Zbąszyniu, mogli odsłuchać I to nie była ktoś, kto się tego nauczył, to drugie pokolenie, które się nauczyło. Piosenki po hebrajsku, śpiewanej z zasłyszanego tekstu nauczonego przez, no super.
And we established a partnership with a high school in Israel, and there's a youth exchange going on. And when the Israeli kids came to Zbaszyn, they could listen to an Israeli song in Hebrew, which had been learned by the previous generation of the high school kids, who then passed this on to the next generation. Now that's really great.
Amazing. Just amazing. We have such an embarrassment of riches here with the two of you, and I really wish we could continue. But we have to move on here, and I want to say dziękuję to both of you. Forgive my Polish accent. And we just want to hear, we have one thing to add from Susan Berger, who has something to add about a woman she met when in Zbaszyn. So let's bring Susan in for that.
Okay, I'll unmute myself. It's slightly different. When we were in Berlin for the 80th commemoration, Alina Bote got an email. There was a German public television documentary made about Zbaszyn and what happened there. And this woman wrote to Alina saying she grew up in Zbaszyn. Her mother had died just a couple of years earlier, but always talked about a family that stayed with them in 1938 and a little girl named Rita. And that's my mother's name. And she asked if this was the same Rita because my mother was interviewed for that documentary. And we don't know the address of where my mother was. But even if it wasn't my mother, it's quite a story because this woman named her daughter Rita. So it was I don't know if this is familiar to Wojciech at all. I don't know if you can understand me, Wojciech, but I will explain.
Translate.
You will. It was remarkable to me. Whether I don't know how many little girls there were named Rita at that time staying in the homes, but I was really moved by that.
Panie Wojciechu, jeszcze pytanie do pana. Pani Berger mówi, że kiedy była w Berlinie na inauguracji wystawy o Zbaszyniu i w telewizji niemieckiej poszedł film dokumentalny na ten temat, skontaktowała się z nią pani mieszkająca w Berlinie, której rodzice pochodzą ze Zbaszynia, która mówiła, że ci rodzice cały czas wspominali rodzinę żydowską, która była u nich podczas Polen-Aktion. I dziewczynka w tej rodzinie miała na imię Rita, a to jest imię mamy pani Berger. No i ta pani pyta, czy to może być ta sama Rita. I pani Berger mówi, no nie wiemy, bo nie wiemy pod jakim adresem jej mama mieszkała w Zbaszyniu, ale no, nie może być bardzo dużo dziewczynek w Zbaszyniu z Polen-Aktion imieniem Rita, a to jest ważne, bo ta pani, która o tym opowiadała, dała swojej córce imię Rita.
Dzisiaj jest już to proste, bo przez te 10 lat mieliśmy tyle maili, pytań, czy mamy coś, czy są jakieś dokumenty, czy coś pomożemy pomóc. Wszyscy do mnie lądowali z tymi pytaniami, jakbym był wszechwiedzący. Oczywiście penetrowałem dokumenty i udało mi się nam wszystkim, bo to większa grupa pracowała, stworzyć portal zbaszyn1938.pl z wyszukiwarką. I tam jest kilka tysięcy dokumentów i rekordów wystarczy wpisać Rita i listują się wszystkie Rity, które były w Zbaszyn, które mają jakiś dokument, tak? Oczywiście to może być, tak?
Okay, it's not hopeless because I've been getting questions like this ever since I started working on it. And we searched the archives and we eventually set up an internet portal, Zbaszyn1938.pl, which has a search engine. And all you have to do is input Rita into the search engine, and it will give you all the Ritas that we have documentation about. Now, this doesn't, it's not obvious that this solves the question, but it might help.
Okay. Thank you.
Zaraz sprawdzimy, czy jest.
Jim?
This was a magnificent conversation. All, thank you. Unbelievable worlds coming together, possibilities coming out of the sky against a backdrop of obsidian darkness. Absolutely incredible, truly a memorable Yom Hashoah. So thank you, Kostek, thank you, Wojciech, and Judi, thank you for putting the pieces together. And Susan, magnificent, magnificent.
Thank you.
So I guess I'm doing some announcements right now. Again, thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. Just extraordinary. Wojciech made a video where he talks about the process, and we will have that on our website and we'll email it to all participants once we have the English translation locked up with the image. So you all will get that and you'll get to hear more from him. I encourage everyone to check that out. Next up for the Kumah Festival, we will be following the Jewish calendar as it moves from the Holocaust to Israel Independence Day. Please join us next Saturday, April 17th, for a Shabbat conversation with Israel Prize winner and longtime peace activist, Professor David Shulman. David has spent the last 20 years going from his Jerusalem home into the West Bank every week to support Palestinian villages that are under threat with the organization Ta'ayush, the Jewish Arab Partnership for Peace. And in anticipation of this event, please consider attending the joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day ceremony this coming Tuesday, hosted by Combatants for Peace and Parent Circle Families, and sponsored, among many other organizations, by the new Shul. Last year, over 200,000 people attended. There's more information on our website about that. So if you haven't yet registered for the David Shulman event coming up on Saturday, please do so. You can do that on the website, where you can also see the other Kumah events coming up, of which there are many. But David is an internationally sought after speaker, as well as a regular writer on Israel, Palestine for the New York Review of Books. And this will be another powerful gathering that will bring together New York activist Gili Getz, and he's going to moderate the discussion and will feature the musical talents of piano virtuoso Gabriel Zucker, who grew up here at the New Shul, as well as Judi Williams, who is now going to perform for us. Misha?
Thank you, Judi, and thank you, Jim and Wojciech and Konstantin. Thank you all for this really astounding event. But before I pass it on to Judi, who's going to end us back in this country right now, and exactly the place where we need to be thinking about today, I think. We're going to say the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish. And so I invite you to either speak out loud or write into the chat names of anybody you're thinking of today in particular. And if you are in mourning, I invite you to please rise and speak the words with me. Yitgadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. בעלמא דברה חירותי, וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל. שמי דקודשה, בריך הוא. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה. תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל, ואמרו אמן. And now I pass you on to the wonderful, talented Judi Williams.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Shavua Tov. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. So I go to my brother. I say, brother, help me please. But then he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there were times when I thought I wouldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Thank you, Judi. You brought me to tears. That's really beautiful. That's Sam Cooke. In case you didn't recognize it, a change is gonna come. Toda rabba, Judi. Toda rabba, Jim. Toda rabba, Susan Berger. Toda rabba, Judi Miner. Toda rabba, Ellen Gould. Toda rabba, Konstantin. Toda rabba, Wojciech. And toda rabba, thank you so much to all of you for being here with us. And we look forward to next Shabbat at 10 in the morning. Leitraot. Thank you so much.